Well, welcome back to another episode of Hawk Off the Press. My name is Madison Hricik. I am the Iowa football beat reporter for the Gazette, and this week I have Randy Johnson, who is the Minnesota Golden Gophers reporter for the Minneapolis Star Tribune. Randy, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you, Madison. Great to join you here.
Yeah, thank you. So we have the annual Battle for Floyd coming up this Saturday afternoon, an
Mm-hmm.
afternoon game, which I think a lot of Iowa fans are going to be very excited about after almost their entire season being at night.
Okay.
Um, but I'm curious, Randy, just kind of getting right into it. What have been your impressions of this Minnesota football team throughout the season, particularly having such a young quarterback kind of lead their offense?
Well, yeah, Drake Lindsay, redshirt freshman out of Fayetteville, Arkansas, they basically anointed him as the starter. Kind of thought he'd be the when they recruited him back in 2023. They kind of targeted him to be the starter as a redshirt freshman this year, and he has been that, and he has done a very good job. You could argue he's been their best player this year. He's basically very poised. He learned very well from Max Brosmer, their graduate transfer from last year, who's now with the Minnesota Vikings. Basically was attached to the hip of Max and learned through osmosis last year, and has been a very good quarterback for them this year. It just doesn't make a lot of mistakes, gets them into the right play calls with audibles, and he was very impressive last week against Nebraska too.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you have 10 passing touchdowns and 3 interceptions as a starter, as a redshirt freshman, usually it's a pretty good sign for your offense.
Yep.
I wanted to specifically talk about his passing game. What about it has made it so successful? Is it just his capability to read the options on the field? Is there something specific you're noticing with how he's just making these decisions in the moment?
It's a combo of things. It seems like he knows when to get out of a play. It hasn't been perfect, but he's got him out of some bad run situations, got him into, maybe a little bit more of a, dump off type of pass. But he'll take his shots down the field too. And they've, he's been pretty successful with that. And intermediate throws have been pretty good strength for him. He had just a really nice pass on the touchdown to Lemeke Brockington, just kind of dropped it in a bucket for a 20-yarder that put him up 14-6 in the third quarter. So it's it just seems like he's in control, and he doesn't get rattled much. Maybe a little bit in the first road game of the season at Cal, and he'll even admit that a bit. But since then, I mean, he was very calm at Ohio State. That was just one where it wasn't like they were making a ton of mistakes. They just got rolled over by a far superior team.
Yeah, well, and it's difficult to play in a lot of Big Ten stadiums. You mentioned he admitted he was kind of struggling a little bit in his first road game. How do you think the experience at Ohio State might help against a sold-out Kinnick Stadium? Obviously, it's not at night. Like a lot of people talk about Kinnick at night being successful, but it's still a tough road environment.
Yeah, the Ohio State one was at night, so that was a pretty charged atmosphere too. I think that can only help him. He's gone through that one time, and you're only going to get better for going through as tough of an experience as it might have been. But it's not like he was the reason they lost. It was just Ohio State's just overwhelming.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're the number one team in the country for a reason. And I know a lot of people have been interested in Minnesota's defense, particularly that line that had a program record 9 sacks against Nebraska last weekend. Was there something specific that stood out? I know head coach PJ Fleck was talking about how that defensive line just really were dialed up and really invested in that game plan against the Cornhuskers. But what stood out to you about the defensive line for them to be as productive as they were?
Well, it went through a few different things. I would say a few different facets that made it that way. They played very, very well, starting from the beginning of Anthony Smith, their 6'6", 275-pound defensive end, who's he's got NFL written all over him. He looks the part, and he played the part on Saturday. They got depth. Their other defensive ends is kind of a rotation basis here with Jackson Howard and Carter Mentz. They both had a couple of sacks. That was a situation where they're platooning them a little bit, and they're getting a lot of productivity out of them in that game. They got one from defensive tackle Devin Eastern. He cleaned up on a sack there, and then they had a really nice blitz out of linebacker Matt Kingsbury, who just obliterated the running back trying to pass block and then took down Royal. But I will say this, what did help a little bit on that was that Dylan Royal does tend to hang on to the ball a bit. So there are sacks to be had against him. And to the Gophers' credit, they went and found him and got him.
Yeah, well, and that was something that Kirk Ferentz and quarterback for Iowa, Mark Gronowski, mentioned as well, is that they had noticed that Raiola had held onto the ball a little bit too long. Is 9 sacks, like, have you seen a game where there's been that many sacks in a single game? Was that a first for you?
That was a record, a program record, and the records go back to 1977. So yeah, that's the
Mhm.
first time I'd seen it. So
Yeah, I'm curious, have you seen it maybe anywhere else that you've potentially covered as well, or is it just like that
oh boy,
that's
I'd
just
have to,
like
over the years, yeah, I mean, I covered Penn State back in the early '90s. They might have had a game like that against overmatched opponent, but I'm trying to think, I don't remember the Gophers being that active against anybody.
Well, I think that just shows how impressive 9 sacks in a single game can be.
Yeah.
To flip the script a little bit, mentioned a little bit of Minnesota. I'm curious, what have you seen from Iowa as you've done your research prepping for this game following the Big Ten this year? What has stood out to you with the Hawkeyes this year?
Well, I'm always interested in the quarterback there with Gronowski. I followed him at South Dakota State. I'm from South Dakota originally, so it's kind of had a little bit interest in there and watching him what he did with at the FCS level, which was very good. And when I heard that he was transferring to Iowa, it's like, well, that makes perfect sense. I mean, it seems like he's like just a plug and play type of quarterback from there. Early on, I think that shoulder surgery in the offseason probably is maybe limited him a bit early on in the season, but I think he's been he can run, that's for sure. I mean, he's 10 touchdown runs and then 130 yards last week against Penn State was pretty impressive, especially that long 67-yarder. Iowa. What's impressed me about them is they do what they do and they do it well. That's always been their MO under Kirk Ferentz, and I'm sure you go back to Hayden Fry and it was that type of situation too. But and they're always going to be good on special teams. They're going to get those hidden yards on punting and punt returns and everything like that. And I know I bring up the phrase punt returns, and I'm sure that's going to light up a lot of people down in Hawkeye land. It's an area where they've always been just extremely efficient.
And when you look at this matchup this year, is there something specific? Is it the quarterback matchup that stands out to you? Is it the line of scrimmage? What position battle are you potentially looking at to be a focal point for who potentially could come out on top?
Oh, I'm looking at that Iowa offensive line. I want to see that thing up close and watch it. And they're, you just look at Pro Football Focus, and they're just in love with those players. And
They really have.
they're veteran, and they're very productive. They're very agile. They can do a lot of different things. Run the ball, pass protect. So that's going to be. I think it's would be one of the key factors in the game if the Gophers defense can, handle that line and get Iowa's offense off the field. Make sure they keep Gronowski contained somewhat. He's not going to sit back there and take the hits like Raiola did. He's going to get out and use his legs and get yards if they're available.
Yeah, you mentioned that PFF grade. I just pulled it up. They gave Iowa a 89 for PFF. That was the best grade that they've given a team that this past week. 91 in pass block grade. That's third. 3 pressures were allowed. An 84.7 run block grade. That's also first. And then on top of that, that was the second straight game that Iowa had 200 or more rushing yards.
Yeah.
So you look at that line and you understand why PFF is such a big fan of the Hawkeyes right now, and why that line of scrimmage is going to be so important.
Yeah, it's that when you can rush for 200 yards, a lot of that means is that the other team does not have the ball, and the other team has a heck of a time scoring when their offense is sitting on the sideline.
I wanted to ask you a little bit. I remember watching Coach Fleck's press conference, and he was talking a lot about the Minnesota defensive coordinator and how he's evolved in his role over the last few years. How have you seen that evolve, kind of take place leading up to, obviously, a lot of people are going to focus on the 9 sacks against Nebraska, but how have you seen that gradually reach that point where there are a lot more people that are interested in focusing in on the defensive line success?
Yeah, it's interesting. Danny Collins, basically, he's worked his way up. He's been with Fleck for about 13 years. I go back to Fleck's days in Western Michigan. Basically started off as an intern, sleeping in a storage closet. While he's just learning the trade and everything, and now he got the defensive coordinator job after they had Corey Heatherman there last year, who did a very fine job, and then ended up getting hired away by Miami after the Gophers had given him a raise and an extension, but then Miami came with some a better offer, and so he took that. So PJ stayed hired from within. He's big on. I wrote about it for today's paper. Basically, when PJ took the job, one of his blueprints that he followed is what Ferentz had done at Iowa. Just the whole cultural sustainability. You look at assistant coaches who are there for a long time. Your defensive coordinators there, Norm Parker and then Phil Parker. They both were there for over 10, 12 years. Basically, you get that consistency where you know what to expect from a team, and they play a certain way and they do it efficiently.
Mm-hmm. And when you have that efficiency and that culture, I know Iowa fans have seen it time and time again. It becomes a situation like the offensive line where there were a couple holes this year, and it seems like it's been a plug and play, like the quarterback position you were mentioning. Have you seen it kind of start to reach a point where it is a little bit more of that plug and play kind of coaching style?
Yeah, it's getting there in Minnesota. They're where they've really developed over the years since Fleck's early years is getting depth along the lines. That's always a tough situation. You want to be able to get somebody in there, say who's like a third year sophomore, get them starting, but it's sometimes they take longer. But we're seeing more and more where they're getting guys that are maybe starting at that age and hanging around for all 4 years or 5 years and becoming a pretty good player and even a pro draft pick by the time they got out there. They had a guy in Fleck's first recruiting class, John Michael Schmitz, turned into an All-American center, and now he starts for the Giants. There's situations like that where they've developed guys that if not playing in the pros, they were pretty darn good college players.
Mm-hmm. And kind of sticking with the defensive theme here, there's a former Hawkeye that'll be wearing a Minnesota jersey in Kinnick on Saturday afternoon, and that's John Nestor, defensive back. What have you seen from him since he's joined the Golden Gophers roster? He had a little bit of success, but not a ton of playing time in an Iowa uniform. I'm curious, how have you seen him kind of grow throughout this new program and this new role he's in?
He's a guy with a lot of energy, he's extremely fired up when he's playing. He had a really good game against Purdue a couple weeks ago, but he missed last week's game because of an injury, and we'll find out Saturday if he's playing against the Hawkeyes. I'm sure he wants to get in there as badly as he can. He was in jersey and sweats on the sideline last week, so it's depending on what the injury is, and PJ Fleck is very close to the vest on injuries. When you ask about him, he'll say, "Well, we have the injury report that's coming out 2 hours before the game, and we'll have more information there." So it's I wouldn't be surprised to see him playing, but if it's like a soft tissue injury, it's some type of strain or a pull or a hamstring or something like that. Like a 2 week time sometimes isn't enough, but we'll see.
Yeah, sometimes those injuries always just kind of linger a little bit longer than maybe most football players and coaches would like. So now I'm curious, we get to the part where we kind of look at the importance of this game in general with the Floyd of Rosedale Trophy at stake. As somebody who's experiencing this rivalry for the very first time, what has been your favorite part about covering the Iowa versus Minnesota rivalry over the years?
There's a lot of there's been a lot of back and forth over the years on on between the fans. The fan base is, I like to say most of the time it's good natured ribbing and stuff. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's they get pretty pointed and pretty aggressive each way. I go back to I was with the Minnesota Daily back in 1990. Iowa had already clinched a Rose Bowl berth. They're playing Minnesota in the Metrodome. Tons of Iowa fans in there. Early in the third quarter, the Gophers are up by a touchdown roughly, and they're backed up a shadow of their own end zone. And this is back in the day where if the crowd got too loud, a quarterback could go to the ref to for some little bit of a break or whatever. They'd stop the clock and try to reset it and see if things would calm down. The Gophers quarterback had to do that in his own house because it got so loud. So you saw that. You saw the year that the Hawkeyes tore down the goalposts in the Metrodome and took them outside through the revolving doors. So there's been some things back and forth in the rivalry. It's one of the Gophers fans' favorite cheers is "Who hates Iowa? We hate Iowa." That type of thing. So and then you're playing for a bronze hog. There's not much more fitting than that.
Yes. I recently learned, I had no idea, and I've been doing a lot of studying trying to understand the history behind this rivalry and the Floyd of Rosedale trophy. I had no idea it weighed almost 100 pounds.
Yeah.
Like it is a very heavy I had no idea. I think that's the thing that's probably blown my mind more than anything else. And I've told other people who are learning this with me because I just am telling them, I'm like, yeah, this is like almost 100 pounds trophy. You look at it and it's like there are some taller trophies there too that are not nearly the same, like not nearly as heavy. So that's fun. It's just like a fun fact that I was just like, oh my gosh.
Yeah, it's a hefty piece, that's for sure.
Yes. All right, so we've got to the point where it's time to do predictions. So we'll do 2 questions here. Basically, it's the same thing as I asked earlier, just kind of flipped. What does Minnesota need to do to be able to beat Iowa this weekend?
They need to run the ball efficiently, and they need to stop the run. I think those are the 2 things. They showed much more physicality last week against Nebraska, and they're going to need that and more, I think, against Iowa, especially going up against that offensive line.
Mm-hmm. And then on the flip side, what does Iowa need to do to beat Minnesota?
I think Iowa needs to avoid turnovers, avoid giving up the big play. I think if they can get some pressure on Drake Lindsey, they can make things uncomfortable for him. And if they don't, if they do their typical, if they get their typical effort out of special teams, that'll put them in a strong situation, advantageous situation. So, I think they, mainly play their game and not make mistakes.
Mm-hmm. It seems like a lot of these, especially these like rivalry games, often do come down to those final plays. Who's going to make the right play at the right time?
Yep.
I was going to say, does that seem like does this kind of matchup build up feel like it's going to be one of those kinds of games as well?
Yeah, you see the point spread at like 9.5, and it's like I think that to me that seems pretty high, but I'm picking like a 3-4 point game. I just think it's going to be tight, and that's what you usually see against those 2 teams. Last year was Iowa pulled away in the second half and pretty much dominated the second half and won by 17. But we've had years. 2 years ago was 12-10, and that's with the Gophers not having the best quarterback in the world back that year. It just sometimes it's even Fleck's first year the Gophers lost 17-10, and they had a play where their tight end was going in for a touchdown. He's going to have a perfect late release off the line. Pass is going to be right to him, and he trips on his feet. What do you do? This sometimes it just doesn't happen for you. But it looks I think I expect a tight game.
Yeah, the parody of college sports and the parody of a rivalry that's gone on as long as this one seems to never surprise. That is the biggest lesson I have learned throughout covering college sports. Well, Randy, thank you so much for joining. I know that there's been a very busy crossover season for you with hockey starting to get underway as well, and obviously the Vikings are happening. So best of luck for you. And
fun time of year, that's for sure.
That is for sure. If you like this, you can follow along at Hawk Off the Press every week for our podcast, and you can sign up for my free newsletter through thegazette.com. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you next time.